Welcome, folks. Welcome to this month's episode of Unhoused and Unscripted. I am your host, Joseph Alonzo, CEO at Cocoon House, and I am here today with Kate Walden, our internal Thrive Services Manager at Cocoon House, also the chair of our Cocoon House advocacy team. And we're here to talk a little bit about a segment of homelessness that is around human trafficking. And January is the National Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and so we thought this would be a great time to kick off the month with some discussion on how human trafficking and homelessness intersect in the communities that we're serving. So, Kate, thank you very much for being here with us today. And I think one of the things that I always wonder about is people know about Cocoon House in our community, and they're familiar with the work that we do with youth that are experiencing homelessness, but for some folks, this idea of like, what is trafficking? Like, what does that mean? What are young people going through that in a situation? What does it look like if they're being trafficked? So, can you talk a little bit about kind of the ways that shows up within our populations that we serve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a fairly common misconception. A lot of folks consider trafficking as there's always a third-party trafficker. We think about, things we've seen in movies. We think about these kinds of stereotypes, right? But a lot of what happens with trafficking at the intersection of youth homelessness is that we see a lot of survival sex is something that really comes up a lot when we're considering sex trafficking, for example. So someone doesn't have a place to stay, and then if anyone offers them a place to stay and maybe asks them to exchange sex acts for that shelter or for food or for substances or anything of value, that is also actually sex trafficking under the federal and state laws. So a lot of people don't really recognize that that is a way that that's commonly playing out, is that lack of resources can be such a vulnerability factor to trafficking. In addition to the fact that where there are third-party traffickers involved, like sometimes they're really luring people in with these false promises of love or employment or resources that they may need. So there's really a lot more to the situation than just, oh, youth are going out and doing what they're going to do. Like there's been a little bit of a shift in our way of thinking around that, understanding that youth are really put in these positions where they have to make super difficult choices when there's resource scarcity.
Right. And would you say that those choices oftentimes are, it feels to me like they're uninformed, right? Like a youth doesn't necessarily consciously decide today I'm going to engage in, sex trafficking. From my experience in working in programs and working with young people, a lot of times it's masked in a relationship that they think is a loving relationship. They think that they've got a partner, and then that down the line somewhere that partner introduces them into other partnerships, and all under this loving umbrella that snowballs into a place where they become out of control before they really even understand what's going on. Is that something that we see in your experience as well?
Yeah, that is certainly one way that happens, whether that's an older partner or, someone that they themselves as a youth have been introduced
Right.
to, the sex trades or, any kind of exchange of something of value for sex acts. Like that's certainly something that we see a lot.
Yeah.
In addition to the fact that we do have people that actively groom and recruit, so
Right.
there's an intentionality behind that. I always tell folks, like, wherever there is someone that has intention to exploit and someone that has needs that need to be met, you have conditions that could be right for trafficking. Like it doesn't matter what age or socioeconomic status or gender or racial identity, it can really happen to anyone. Yeah. In addition to the fact that I think that we miss out on the fact that there's not those resources sometimes in our official systems, right? Like if there's no shelter availability, if there isn't someone that's going to answer your call at midnight, traffickers will. And so sometimes people neglect to realize that if we can't offer something in place of that, if there are some of those gaps in services and resources, then I understand that youth may see that as a realistic way to meet their needs, right?
Wow. That's a powerful statement. Yeah. If someone doesn't answer the call, a trafficker will.
Yeah, we clock out at 5 sometimes. So
I don't mean to make light of it, but it is true. Like, so what are some of the things that that Cocoon House is doing or can do to support a young person that we find in this experience?
I will say this as an overall statement. One thing that we can do is we can be trustworthy adults. We can be those people that they can go to say, hey, I need food, I need shelter, I need to find this thing. It can be a sounding board for some of the issues they're experiencing, even just to ask, hey, is this healthy or not, what this person is asking me to do? That sounds weird. And we can be that source of responsibility and guidance and making sure that they have other ways to meet their needs besides being exploited. because oftentimes youth don't even realize that what's happening to them is a crime, that they're a victim of a crime.
Sure. So education, right?
Yeah, that can be an element of coercion that we see fairly commonly, right? Like, people will say, hey, like, you've done all these things, so therefore, if you tell anyone what's going on, you're going to be arrested. You're the one who's going to be in trouble. And how would they know differently, right? So being able to provide that information and education and connection to resources is one of the main things that all of our programs do. Additionally, our shelters are an excellent resource. We do have an emergency shelter, and they are all trained on trafficking and what that looks like and how to support our youth. They do an amazing job, and it's also a very low barrier program, so that even when people are coming in with, let's say challenging behaviors or, problems with substance use, we have a lot of different ways that we have supported youth that are going through those issues already. And then it's just with that additional context, knowing, some of the unique struggles they may face in shelter or in services or, in finding housing.
Now, I want to give you a little bit of credit here, Kate, because you just said we have a shelter and we got fantastic shelter, fantastic staff. But what I've known is historically identifying a youth that's at risk of being trafficked or is currently being trafficked can sometimes be hard to identify, can be hard to name. And so sometimes we've seen a youth will come into our shelter that would qualify as being trafficked, and we don't pick up on it right away. And your role as the Thrive Services Manager at Cocoon House has been, in large in part, going around to the different programs and helping identify, helping staff be able to recognize and name the issue and get resources connected to that youth much more quickly. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience has been like for you? Just being able to train staff and work with our staff, and have you seen our capacity to serve improve as a result?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Well, we start off with, I train everyone monthly, all of our new employees that come in through Cocoon House on what trafficking is, like the legal framework and, how we can identify, or some of the signs and indicators at least, that make us want to ask some more questions, and strategies for engagement and some of those basic resources. So everyone's got a baseline level of knowledge. And then in going around to the programs and seeing what they're facing and what concerns they have, we're able to kind of individually connect on ways to engage with the youth that we're actually noticing might have some of these signs and indicators, and offering reminders about the types of things that we should be looking out for. And also just even trauma-informed language, how to make sure that we're talking in a way that youth are going to hear, and that's not stigmatizing, and that's not going to break rapport with the youth. There's a lot of factors to consider when it comes to just like the human-to-human involvement between our staff and youth, and how we're landing. And we also are really noticing a lot higher proficiency in staff being able to say, hey, something's not right about this. And in those situations, often I just encourage them to reach out to me. I do consultation with people internally here and externally in the community, to just kind of think through next steps. What resources may apply, what's already been tried, who has the best rapport even with the youth, who might be the best person to have this conversation, and really just get down to a step-by-step plan. So that we can try to meet those needs as best as possible, especially when we know that youth may or may not want to tell us everything that's going on, but what we know, we can support. Yeah.
You mentioned trust, and I think with this population, just in the limited amount that I know, trust is very, very hard to earn and easy to lose. And so it's just a very delicate environment in that relationship. And so how does that, you mentioned shelter resources being limited, or even if shelter resources are available, maybe not the right placement for someone who's been trafficked. And can you talk a little bit about why that might be, or why not all shelters are a good fit for a young person that we might be serving?
Absolutely. So, I mean, speaking more specifically to 18 or under 18 populations here, when we're talking about minors experiencing, we'll just zone in on sex trafficking for a minute, since that's more commonly what we're seeing. But essentially, sometimes shelters are not the best resource because they're publicly available addresses oftentimes, unless it's a confidential shelter, which there are very few confidential shelters available for people under the age of 18. Versus domestic violence shelters over the age of 18. A lot of those addresses are confidential and kept under wraps so that people aren't able to just show up there, right? So that's one thing that can be a barrier. Beyond that, there's also typically a requirement for parental consent to shelter, which we have, some different guidelines now, some different laws that have gone into place that have made that some exceptions when there's issues of safety. But that being said, like if a youth is not necessarily willing to disclose the lack of safety they may be experiencing at home, if their family is their trafficker or someone that lives within their household is their trafficker, that's another barrier that we see. Like they don't necessarily want someone to know where they've gone to. And the general lack of availability of shelter is a huge risk factor as it stands. So if you're ready to leave your trafficker, it may not line up with that exact moment where there's a spot for you at a shelter, and maybe you don't have transportation or these other resources, and they may not know that those exist for them. So as you mentioned earlier, education and outreach is a huge piece of this because oftentimes people are not quite sure how to start that process, and we can be very helpful in starting that process and identifying what their rights are, what's available to them, how to navigate some of these really complex resources that, again, may not be coming right at the time that a youth is really convinced that they are ready to leave.
Right.
That can be a process in and of itself for so many different reasons.
Cool. Yeah, that's helpful. I think, knowing what resources are available, that's something that you've done a lot of work around, also bringing into the Cocoon House sphere and young people. Do you have key partners that you've identified that we can work with in Snohomish County? And do you want to plug those names here?
Yeah, absolutely. We have some excellent community partners. And I will say that we do a lot of regional work as well, just given the nature of trafficking.
Yeah.
Folks aren't often
talk
staying
about
in one
that.
area.
Right?
Yeah. There's a lot that happens as far as, people trying to seek, even just shelter resources alone will bring you all up and down Western Washington here, especially in the I-5 corridor. Sometimes as a part of people's trafficking experience, they're traveling through those areas. So often we're finding that, connection with service providers looks a lot more broad than it may in the general population of youth experiencing homelessness, geographically, that is. But I will say Providence Intervention Center for Assault and Abuse is one of our closest community partners. We'll do events with them sometimes. They just came to our drop-in center and did a healthy relationships event where they gave out prizes and we talked about healthy relationship, red flags, green flags, yellow flags. So it was a fantastic conversation with our youth. So they're fantastic. And then we also have emergency services available through them. They do have a human trafficking specialist there, a crime victim advocate, and all of the different things that we would recommend for any form of sexual violence, including trafficking. So they have a lot of really excellent programs, including therapy, forensic interviewing there, advocacy, legal advocacy. We also work with a variety of domestic violence services as well, especially for our 18 and over clients as it pertains to shelter. They do have confidential shelters, DV agencies often. So those are other partners that we work with, like Domestic Violence Services of Snohomish County and Skagit DV SAS. Really anywhere in King County, we work with New Beginnings and the Hope Line. So there's a lot of different places that we refer when something's just a little bit out of our service area, or for those specific scenarios where people actually need like safety sensitive, a private location type services, right? Yeah,
it's complex, right? And I know that I've heard stories from our staff trying to work and case manage young people that are being trafficked. A lot of times they are regional or even multi-state, right? Like the I-5 corridors, definitely a commonly traveled geography all the way through California, Vegas, back, right? And so I guess what I want to ask is how often do you have a youth engage, disengage, engage, disengage, before we're able to kind of help stabilize them out of the life of being trafficked?
Oh, extremely frequently. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the things that I go over fairly commonly when I'm working with the youth is just ways to remember how to get a hold of me, just in case your phone gets taken or lost, or, if something happens where, they have to get out of Dodge for a while. Sometimes safety issues in and of themselves will be the cause of that, going in and out, right? So I think another thing that we've done to address that issue, just to highlight, we actually do facilitate as part of the Thrive program and Cocoon Households that the North Sound Exploitation Response Network, affectionately known as NERN.
I love the acronyms.
Thank you. It sounded fun. But essentially, we realized that was happening where service providers weren't really able to coordinate with each other as effectively when we are noticing, like, we probably have a lot of the same clients. And so we do have an anti-trafficking task force that now includes Snohomish, Skagit, Whatcom, and Island counties, so that all of those service providers that have potential to work with youth experiencing trafficking, youth and young people, that is, 12 through 24 is our focus here, as you're well aware. But anyone that has potential to run into that population, including medical service providers, DCYF, juvenile justice centers, police, and all sorts of different key stakeholders. We're meeting together to figure out how are we responding to this, how are we screening for this, and then how is this referral process going between our counties and our individual agencies. So that's been another thing that we've been doing to really try and address that need.
Yeah, it's super encouraging to know that there's so many different entities coming together to try to serve roughly the same population of young folks that are really in a bad situation. Can you talk a little bit about the advocacy front? So I know, because we work together on the advocacy team, that you're a passionate advocate for policy and for change when there's barriers for our young people to find success. And can you think of, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but just wins or even just areas where advocacy efforts have been put forward to help serve this particular population, both locally or or beyond?
Yeah, that is definitely something that there's so many things that I can think of that I'm trying to think of what would be the best example. One of the more recent examples that I remember talking to you about just a little bit, there was actually a beautiful rally that King County Sexual Assault Resource Center held recently that was around VOCA funding, which essentially, just very brief overview of the issue, the funding for our victim services. So that includes, sexual violence and domestic violence and human trafficking as well. That funding source is somewhat unstable or very unstable, I would say. And we're really hoping that the Washington State Legislature will provide for more stable long-term funding for those services, as every year, we're kind of concerned that maybe some of those services will have to be cut in a way that really will harm the way that survivors are healing and able to access emergency services. So they held a rally to point out that issue and to educate on it. And they had a lot of speakers there. We attended as Cocoon House. I am really encouraged to see that there's a lot more coordination happening between agencies in that way to point out things that are, very, very important and sometimes can be missed in the day-to-day work.
Right.
So that was a really fantastic one. They actually made bracelets for all of us, and we gave bracelets to the legislators as well as kind of a gift to say, hey, please fund this. And also here's a bracelet that says support survivors. Or
a little reminder to wear around your wrist. Right?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite bracelets I've ever had. So, even things as simple as that, right? Like there's so many different ways that we can be coming together to point out these broader issues in ways that are also still building relationships, which I think is kind of the nature of advocacy, is finding that mutual common ground. And then also saying, hey, something needs to change here. Still making sure that there is a space for the voices of the folks that are really experiencing the worst impacts of these policies.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And for folks watching the podcast, advocacy is one of our top agency values. And so constantly, I'm kind of marveled by Kate here, who does the direct service work and works with young people directly, but then takes those experiences and takes them to the state legislature and advocacy opportunities around the area, because that's really needed. And you've got real-time examples of what we see in the day-to-day and how we can affect change at the policy level. So just want to applaud that effort that you lead.
Thank you so much. And I will say one thing that I'm really hoping we can continue to emphasize, both as our general advocacy team at Cocoon House and of course any advocacy in the anti-trafficking space, is that survivor voice. Some of our youth are ready to speak to their experience, and that's one of the beautiful things that we get to see in this transformation of experiencing instability to getting more housing stability and getting goal set and kind of settling into what it looks like to not be in that exploitation space anymore. And then also seeing the ways that they actually want to help other people as well. They want to share their stories. They want to also talk to legislators. They also want to demand their rights and their funding and all of these other things that they maybe didn't have in their own healing process so far. It's a really cool thing to see. And I think one of the key functions of our agency and our work overall is to, not be the voice for the voiceless, but to make a space for their voice to be heard.
Yeah.
So that's really the focus of what we're hoping to do, and also hoping to make sure that those opportunities are fairly compensated and that we're preparing people well for the civic engagement that they hopefully will be engaged in for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
That's just my hope.
No, I see those seeds being planted, every day around the organization. I think that's something, the path we've been on is trying to bring youth into that recognition that it's not us speaking for you, it's your voice at the table, and how do we authentically promote that in any forum, right? And I've seen those efforts, and I've seen the way that the Cocoon House advocacy team has really kind of led some of that, and it's really, really encouraging. So yeah, thank you for that. One kind of last question, in terms of numbers, like people might want to know, how many young people that we serve in a year or in a given time frame are experiencing trafficking, and what percentage of youth that are experiencing homelessness are also involved in trafficking, and how is it a youth becomes homeless and then within 6 months they're being at risk of trafficking? Does it happen right away? Like, do you have any kind of anecdotal statistics on how that all works?
Yeah, that is such a great question and such a common question, and one that I'm afraid that people may be a bit disappointed in my answer, which is that technically, we don't really have prevalence numbers that we know for sure we can rely on.
Yep.
And one of the reasons for that is that it is a very hidden crime. There's a lot of stigma attached to, again, referencing more specifically, the sex trades and sex trafficking. There's a lot of stigma around that. So, a lot of folks, will maybe never disclose or may never disclose explicitly. There's a lot of situations where maybe we screen at intake, but we don't screen at another time. So once a rapport has been built, maybe they might disclose at some point, but not with the data that we have.
Right.
It's also really difficult to aggregate that data across different agencies, across the county.
Sure.
Everyone's kind of doing that a little bit differently. So that is one of the major efforts that's happening right now, is getting closer to figuring out how can we be standardizing to some extent the way that we're gauging for this issue, so that we can rely on those numbers and also prove what gaps in resources are still needed. But I will say that National Network for Youth has done some studies, and I believe it's 18 to 40% of youth experiencing homelessness have experienced either sex or labor trafficking or both while they were homeless.
Wow.
I might be misquoting that ever so slightly.
but certainly not a rarity. I mean, it's definitely it's prevalent within the homeless youth population. It's pretty safe to believe that a good percentage of the young folks that we're working with have some experience.
Or even, when you consider maybe they haven't experienced trafficking for a certain period of time, where they actually did have a trafficker, where they did engage in survival sex, but even the amount of times that someone has been offered, right? Like, that's something that I think we also don't consider. Has someone ever offered that to you? Sometimes that is on the table, even if it's not something that they're going to speak to us about. So obviously, as I mentioned before, it comes down to those people that have intention to exploit. That is a major thing we need to focus on. Like, who are these folks that are, willing to, say, hey, here's a place to stay for, sexual acts. Like, that's obviously not okay. So as we always say when we're doing training, like, when you think about it, like, isn't 1 too much? Isn't 10 too much? Like, that's a pretty big issue as it stands. Like, when you really stop to think about what kind of position that puts a youth in and what kind of position they have to be in to accept that offer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, what must they be having to face?
And I do think, just to add one more statistic, and again, apologies if I'm slightly misquoting, but I do believe that NCMEC had done a study in 2023, and I think they estimated that 1 in 6 of the youth that were reporting missing and exploited, they suspected were being trafficked, or there was a trafficking concern reported along with the missing report. So 1 in 6 is a lot. Like, even if that is, not an exactly correct estimate, that gives us a view of the issue being still in the tens of thousands at the very least.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of scary, and when you think about that impact and you think about people, when you put a face and a name to the issue, it's jarring. And I do think it's very complex, and youth homelessness itself is complex, but there's so many different intersections of things that our young people face by having housing instability, and this being one of several. And I think my hope and the goal of this is to raise awareness to the issue, and again, let folks know that January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. This is, obviously Kate has a wealth of knowledge and has done a ton to move the marks for Cocoon House into being an effective service provider in this space. But our goal is really to have community brought in through continuing to educate, get involved in advocacy. There's a lot of opportunities Kate's talked about to advocate, but also support organizations. She named a few of them, really great organizations that are partnering with us in this work, and to just get involved in any way that makes sense for you. And so, Kate, just want to thank you for your time and being here and providing me with some inspiration and continual education. And if there's anything else you want to add, this would be a great time to do it.
Yeah, I will always take a little mic space. I did just want to say, I would really encourage, beyond following things for January, continue to educate yourself. There's so many resources out there. So if you're confused about anything about trafficking, if you don't know very much about it, you're welcome to contact me. I provide training for free to the community. That's one way you could get that. And also so many other amazing resources to learn more about that. And also, I just want to challenge everyone, maybe let's debunk some of those misunderstandings. Let's use less stigmatizing language and really just prioritize respect for everyone that we're coming in contact with. Because oftentimes those are the small yet most important steps we can do to help anyone, but especially people that are struggling with this particular issue and experiencing exploitation. So
no one got here by choice. That's exactly right. I mean, by intention. Well, Kate, thank you. And you heard it, folks. Kate Walden, Thrive Services Manager at Cocoon House. This is Unhoused and Unscripted. Joe Alonzo, CEO, signing off. We thank you, and go get them in January.